when it's all said and done. But in any case, it doesn't matter whether it's speed, whether it's photons or whether it's neutrinos or whether it's anything else. You have to have a constant for your top speed in moving information from pixel to pixel to pixel. Needs to be a constant. That's what makes your virtual reality livable. Now, I have to caveat that, though. It only has to be approximately constant. It has to be constant from our viewpoint. If there are small variations in it that we don't notice, that still gives us a good reality to work with here, that's fine. So constant is constant from our perception. But that's pretty constant because our delta t is like 10 to the minus 44 seconds. You know, that's pretty small. So little variations would be unnoticeable in any case. So basically, relativity theory is a logical consequence of C being constant, and C being constant is a logical consequence of reality being digital and virtual. Okay. Magnitude C represents a constant that specifies the demands placed on the virtual reality rendering engine. It tells you the refresh rate for the data and how much data and how often do you have to refresh it. So C has evolved to suit the available computational resources within the larger consciousness system, okay, and the fidelity requirements in this virtual reality. All right, well, that's really the end of the physics. These two things are consciousness. Consciousness 1, consciousness 2. They're not really clouds or brains. It's just a graphical, easy thing to get out of PowerPoint, right? PowerPoint has these little clouds that you can write in, but that's consciousness. And the point I want to make about consciousness is that this consciousness is defined by its information. Okay, that's what defines a consciousness. Is what is it aware of? It's conscious. It's information. This is defined by its information. And when these two try to communicate, what happens is this consciousness sees this pointy star, and it tries to communicate that to this consciousness. So this is what was intended by it, which is a result of metaphors and symbols in this information 1. But when this consciousness gets it, it interprets it as this kind of star. And that's based on its information. Its information is a function of its experience. So each one of these consciousness has its own unique experience. Each experience base enables it to think of or be aware of different things. This one is aware of that shape. This one takes that data, turns it into that shape. Now that's kind of obvious that we have a communication problem, right? When it's consciousness to consciousness, because we can't communicate directly. The key here is that we can only communicate with symbols and metaphors. Our language has to be descriptive. You can never share an experience with anybody. Experience is personal. You can describe your experience in symbols and metaphors that make sense to you, that seem to fit what you're experiencing. You can then share that description in terms of your own metaphors and symbols to somebody else, and then they will interpret what that means in terms of their own experience, metaphors and symbols. You see? So when you have an experience, it's just yours. You can share a description of it, but that description won't even be received the way you intend it. So that's the nature of consciousness and of communication. Okay? Content defines the consciousness. Its content is just information. Some of the logical consequences is everyone receives their own personal data stream. Everyone lives in their own unique personal reality. We think we all live in a shared reality. Well, that's just like we're in a multiplayer game. So we do share data, but we all interpret that data differently, and we all have different experience. A couple of fundamental things besides the fact that we all live in our own personal realities, that we all have experiences and that all experiences are subjective. Okay, all experiences are subjective. So we not only live in a statistical and probabilistic reality, we live in a subjective reality. Reality is what we make of it. It's in our heads. It's this consciousness. Okay, so that's a kind of some fundamentals on the way we are. Okay, consciousness is the fundamental reality. The larger consciousness system is a digital information system. Okay, at the most fundamental level, consciousness then is just information. The most fundamental level, information is bits. And at the most fundamental level, bits are binary. Now, that doesn't mean that bits have to be binary. There's other things you could do. We're just looking at the simplest, most fundamental case. Information is non-physical and subjective. Thus, consciousness is non-physical and subjective. And some of you may wonder about the idea that information is non-physical. But if you think about it, information, it's the meaning, the content, the message. It's not the media. It's not the code symbols. So we have a book. The book is the media. The paper is the media. The ink, the words in ink on the pages, those are the code symbols. But neither one of those is actually information. It takes a consciousness to look at those code symbols in that media to interpret the meaning. You see, only consciousness can interpret the meaning, the content. Okay. And that understanding requires a subjective interpretation of the data relative to a unique experience. Okay, in the next 3 slides, we're going to talk about where does consciousness come from. After that, we're going to talk about how do we relate to consciousness, what are we, why are we, and then we're going to talk about the purpose of our physical reality and how it works. So we're going to pull all those together. Okay, information systems. Okay. So information in a digital information system is represented by organized bits. Random bits carry no information. Organized bits can carry information. Information systems have entropy. Entropy is a measure of organization. Okay, entropy is a term that comes out of thermodynamics. It's where it was first appeared. And in thermodynamics, there's a thing called the second law of thermodynamics. And basically what that says is in this physical universe, the entropy of the universe is always equal to or greater than 0. In other words, our universe is decaying. It's coming apart. Its organization is getting less and less as a function of time, and that if we wait long enough, the whole universe will be reduced to a homogeneous cloud of elementary particles. Okay, that's the second law. Not a happy thought, right, if you think you're going to live that long, but take a very long time before we all end up in elementary particles. But anyway, that's where the word entropy comes from, and it's just a measure of organization. It's also a measure of ability to do work, because random things can't do anything. Just random stuff has no ability to change anything or do anything. You have to get organization to build up a structure that can perform something, can do some work. So the two of them go together. So when we talk about high entropy, we mean high randomness. Low entropy, low randomness. Okay? High entropy doesn't have the ability to do much, to change anything. Low entropy, we're talking about structure and organization and rules and that sort of thing, and then you can actually process with that. You can do something with the structure. So that's what those terms mean. Okay, so what entropy means to information is that there is no information in randomness, and that a random set must lower its entropy if it's to contain information. Now, information doesn't have to be in language. It can be in pattern. It can be in shape. Okay, I can make a sequence, and I can go up, down, and you know what's coming next. It's going to be up. How did you know that? Pattern. wasn't language. You could tell that the information was carried in a pattern, you see. So information is just structure. You throw out a bunch of Tinker Toys on the ground. I don't know if you know what Tinker Toys are. They have Tinker Toys in Spain? They have Tinker Toys all over the world, don't they? It's just these little things you stick together, little wheels, and you stick sticks in them and so on. You can build things with them, sort of like Lincoln Logs or whatever. These are child's toys that you construct. Well, if you just throw all the pieces on the floor, you've got randomness. Can't do anything, no information. But as you connect pieces together, the way you connect them is through constraints. If you take this Tinker Toy and you stick a stick in the hole so it sticks there, now these two are constrained as far as their relationship to each other. So it's through constraint that you build structure. Structure allows you to do something. Now you can build up a toy that you can push it and it can roll, or you can drop it and it can break itself into pieces. It has the ability to change things. Okay, and in the same idea of information and entropy, let me talk about free will and decision space. It all goes together. Decision space is defined as that set of things that you can decide to do or not do. It's your choices. Now, it's not all the choices that you have. It's just all the choices that you think you have. In other words, there may be more choices, other things that you could do, but they're just outside of your reality. You don't know about those. We all know how that works, right? There's a lot of times we get stuck in tunnel vision and we have other choices, but we don't realize that we have them. So your decision space are all the choices that you can make, that you know about, that you can make. So I have all these 100 things and I can make these choices. That's my decision space. And what free will is the freedom to choose from among the decisions or among the choices that are in your decision space. And that's all it is. I have a lot of times people have this concept about free will means you get to do whatever you want. You know, that's not it. It's just that you get to choose among the choices that you have. So what does this have to do with growing up? Well, let's say somebody offends you. Somebody steps on your foot and it makes you angry. Well, you can choose whether to be angry or choose whether not to be angry. There's one of your, there's some choices, and you can make that choice. If you choose to be angry, that's a high entropy choice because that's just going to create more randomness. It's going to create more difficulty. Whereas you can choose not to be angry, and that may create more cohesion or more understanding. If you say, well, if you talk about that. So these are all choices that you have to make. All right, so free will in an evolving consciousness can't exist without consciousness. Consciousness cannot exist without free will. Each are logically necessary for the other. You cannot have a consciousness if you don't have a free will to choose. You can't have a free will to choose if you don't have something to make the choice, consciousness. So those two go together. Okay, so consciousness evolution requires choice, and that choice must be free. People sometimes come to the conclusion that if this is a virtual reality and everything's computed, then if everything's computed, doesn't that lead to determinism? No, it doesn't. There's plenty of practical randomness in the system to produce sufficient choices to produce a very large decision space. Okay, so we're not talking, those of you who are computer scientists, there's very special definitions that have to go with randomness. Things that are random, there's a special viewpoint of that. We're only talking about practical randomness. So we have plenty of randomness. We have plenty of decisions to make just based on the uncertainty that we bring to interaction with each other. We interact with each other, and because of that interaction, we have lots of choices. And then we get to choose from that set of choices. And by that choice either is one that helps us grow, move toward love, or it helps us not grow, move toward fear. So that's kind of the way that basically works out. Okay, randomness among sentient entities. There's uncertainty within choice and interaction. Uncertainty is related to the practical randomness. In other words, you could have 5 choices that all seemed equally good. Your final choice then will have a larger random component because you have 5 choices. They all seem about the same. So it's pretty random which one of those you pick. Complex interactions produce practical randomness. I call it social Brownian motion. Brownian motion is where you have another physics term, but Brownian motion, you have a lot of particles in a box, and the particles just distribute themselves randomly in the box. Why? Because they just collide with each other, they bump each other around, and there's an equal probability that any particle could be anywhere in the box. They're just randomly distributed. Brownian motion is just things bumping into each other, spreading themselves out. Well, we have social Brownian motion. We interact with each other. We interact with circumstances. I mean, how many of us planned our lives to be exactly, what we are now? Almost no one, right? You happen to go to this college because it happened to be available at the time. You happen to be there and you happen to get accepted or whatever. Or this career, you're in this career because you started someplace that took you someplace, that took you to someplace else now, and now you're this way, and you never planned that. We're just kind of where we are because of the way our life has bumped us in this social Brownian motion. So there's lots of uncertainty, and that means there's lots of choice. So the fact that it's done in a computer isn't the problem. There is enough uncertainty in the computer. There's enough randomness. There's enough statistics going on that gives us plenty of free will. Randomness among objects is different than randomness among sentient entities. Randomness is intrinsic to objects. Given initial conditions, it's a scientific theory that one can predict particle behavior. When I was in college, we were talking about statistical mechanics, which is using statistics to describe reality. And of course, that runs counter to reality being objective, so professors were very careful to explain that, well, in the real world, particles are objective. If we had all these particles and we put them in the box, and if we knew all their initial conditions, the initial velocity, the initial directions, and so on, we could predict later exactly where where all the particles would be. That's not true. It's not true at all. Even given all initial conditions, we have no idea where they're going to be because they're bouncing in the walls, and the walls are all bouncing around, and the reality really is statistical. So randomness among objects just has to do with the intrinsic uncertainty that belongs to that object and our measurement. So objects are all random, all probability and statistics. People has to do with their uncertainty in the choices that they make. What sort of choices are they going to make? Let's see. So individual free will and their decision space is a direct, it's the exact same idea if you talk about system free will and the system's decision space. Systems are just a bunch of individuals or whatever that makes up the system. So we're talking about people, and all these people come in a group and they make a committee, or they make a group of something. Maybe they make a government. However that group works, it's just the sum of all the pieces. It's all the people, all the uncertainty that comes with all the individuals becomes part of the uncertainty in the group. So now the system has certain choices. The government has certain choices, certain things it can do and it can't do. The group, the committee, and those work exactly the same as the decision space and free will. The free will of the system and the decision space of the system is just a component, or it's just a combination of the free will of the individuals and the decision space of the individuals. Okay. Attributes of consciousness. Talked a little bit about this. Consciousness is a real, finite, large, complex, self-modifying information system. So that's what consciousness is. It has to either evolve or de-evolve. Any system can evolve by lowering its entropy. Okay, you lower your entropy means more organization, more content, more information. Increasing your entropy is basically more randomness, more dissolution, more decay, more falling apart, more struggle. This is a statement that is kind of a big step, but I'll try to explain it to you. Love is the nature of a low entropy consciousness. Okay. Love is the nature of a low entropy consciousness. So if you have an individual consciousness evolves toward lower entropy, that's the same thing as saying it evolves toward higher quality, or it evolves toward more spiritual states of being. Okay, so then low entropy love is the nature of a low entropy consciousness. Okay, associating love with low entropy, the digital information system that is consciousness is about communication, right? We're talking about consciousness as a data set, but it's about communication. It's about interaction, relationship. That's what consciousness is about. We're in this multiplayer game, and it's all about interaction, communication, relationship between subsets of consciousness. Okay, so love, which is no fear or ego, optimizes positive communication, positive interaction and relationship between subsets of consciousness. It lowers system energy. Fear and ego isolates, inhibits, fractures positive communication, interaction, and relationship between subsets of consciousness. So it raises the system entropy. Processes that lower system entropy build, create more organized and profitable set of relationships and interactions that benefit the whole. Processes that lower or that raise system entropy pull things apart, disintegrate, create less organization, less ability to make change, less profitable to the whole system. Okay, here's an example that will help you see it. We'll take 10,000 people, and these 10,000 people, we're going to make two different groups. 10,000 people here in this group, 10,000 people in the second group. This first group, which we'll call the Utopia group, we're going to get these 10,000 people, we're going to give them a certain amount of resources and space, and then we're going to let them go and see what they do with it. Okay? And the first group of 10,000, everybody is loving. It's about other, not about self. They're caring, mutually supportive, cooperative, trusting, helping, building. The whole takes precedence over the self. Everyone looks out for and helps everyone else. Okay, it's a constructive relationships. There are no loafers, no abusers. It's like one big, loving, caring family, supportive. Everyone works hard. Everyone contributes as much as they possibly can. Eventually, everybody has optimized themselves in the system. So think about that. If you have a bunch of people in there like that, they help each other. Somebody invents something, he shares that information. Somebody's house burns down, his neighbors come along and help him build it back up again. Things that are helpful are shared. People do what work that they have the ability to do, and so on. So think, what would that group of people do in, say, 20 years later? You take those 10,000 people, give them fixed resources. How would they function? How would that turn out? Okay. Now we'll call the second group hell. Everyone is full of fear and ego. See if you recognize this place. It's always about self, me at the expense of other, self-centered, no trust. Why help or cooperate? What's in it for me? Competitive. If you can, you demean and debilitate your enemies, your competition. You eliminate your competition. Trick, manipulate, control, dominate. Use others to satisfy your own needs. Violence, power is the final arbiter of disputes. Okay? It's basically law of the jungle. The strong take advantage of the weak. And how does that turn out? Well, eventually 3% of the population owns 95% of the wealth. Most people are poor, overworked, miserable, and dysfunctional. In fact, even that top 3% of the power pyramid is mostly dysfunctional as well. Love and trust is for fools and suckers. Right? That's the kind of world you get. What about that other world, the utopia? Basically, everybody optimizes themselves and the whole. Okay, everybody contributes what they can. They work together. So you see, that's a good way of thinking about love is the nature of a low entropy consciousness. So if you have low entropy interactions, then it's constructive. You build. Low entropy is love. Love is low entropy. Okay, if you have high entropy, that's fear. That's ego. That's everybody grabbing what they can and then trying to keep it. So in hell, in order to keep what you have to have defenses, right? Or you group together in mutual defense packs. So you all help each other keep your stuff. And then, of course, this other mutual defense pack over here, you fight. And then you have wars, right, between those groups that are all together to protect each other. Then they fight with each other. It sounds like nations, or fiefdoms, or castles and the serfs. So we live in hell, it would appear. That's basically the way our experience is. And that's because there's not a whole lot of love going on here. This is not a graduate school for advanced consciousness. This is an elementary school, perhaps a daycare, maybe even a pre-daycare. But that's the nature of the reality that we live in, and it's because we, in general, are just at the beginning stages of evolving the quality of our consciousness. So when you look out at the world and you go home and you read the newspaper and you watch the news on your television, you see something that's generally kind of ugly, and you see all the dysfunction, you see all the misery, you see all the lying and cheating and stealing going on. And I get asked a lot, why is it like that? Why is our world so awful? Well, it's because that's the way we are. What you see on the nightly news is an honest and accurate reflection of what we are. We as a species. It's what we are. That's why you see it. That's the level that we're at. Now I'm hopeful that that's continually getting better, but we don't sound too much like utopia just yet. Okay. All right. So if we have that first piece of aware consciousness, it had an awareness of this or that. It can modify itself. It can duplicate. See, it sounds just like the biological cells. It can duplicate. So if it had a this or that, it can have a this and that and something else. It can have more than 3 states. It can have lots of these. It discovers synergy, pattern. Okay, the this and that's a 1 and a 0. So anything that can differentiate 2 states can differentiate more states or lots of 1s and 0s, right? So we end up with a information system that's digital, it's consciousness, it's evolving. Eventually it discovers the 1s and 0s can be in patterns, and then there's patterns of patterns. It discovers that those patterns define information. A pattern, remember, had information in it. Information defines content. Then it invents time. Now you have sequence of patterns, patterns that come in a row. Now you have language. Now you have mathematics. You have all these things developed just out of a consciousness being able to differentiate 2 states, 1 and a 0. Okay. So we get then and says, well, that's nice, but where did that potential energy come from? Let's go back one more step. Well, we just don't know. You don't. There's lots of unanswerable questions. There is a limit to our knowledge, what we can know, and that's not a flaw in a theory anymore. It's really a flaw in Darwin's theory. You have to start with assumptions and work from there. What makes a theory good is whether it answers all the data and whether it has the fewest assumptions possible. There's a logical criteria called Occam's razor that says if you have too many assumptions, then you could just be making it up. You can prop any idea up if you make enough assumptions. The theory that is more likely to be correct is the one that answers all the questions, answers all the mail, connects all the dots, and has the fewest number of assumptions. Okay, so we're going to have just 2. All right. So this theory is very much a theory like Darwin's, works the same way. I think we've just about done those. We'll hit the summary and then we'll go to lunch. There's limits to knowledge. In this diagram, this little red spot is us in our universe. This is physical matter reality, a little red spot. Then this little bigger brown spot around it, that's our system. That's kind of what creates, where we are created. That's where the big computer is, you see. That's what creates this virtual reality of ours. So we have us in our universe, then we have this non-physical reality around us, and then we have the larger consciousness system. That's the bigger part of the non-physical. And then after that, we have this big thing which is beyond the larger consciousness system. And when you say, well, where did that first potential energy come from that then had the this and that? Now you're asking me about this, beyond the larger consciousness system. There's a few issues with that. For one, you cannot, if you're consciousness, you cannot perceive beyond consciousness. You are consciousness. So in order to perceive consciousness objectively, if you will, you have to perceive it from the outside of consciousness. And if you are consciousness, that's problematical. You see, you can't, that's like in the flatland, you can't perceive that which goes outside of what you are. So that's one problem. But I make a little analogy with this to make it more understandable. I say that consider that little red dot. That's like a bacterium, and it's living in our intestine, in our GI tract. Okay, then that makes this big thing around it. Then that is our GI tract. So here we have an intestine, small intestine. The GI tract would be our whole system from mouth to anus, and that's the bigger one. And then bigger than that's the body, and this is outside the body now. So you see a bacterium in our system, even if it was brilliant, even if it had an perfect IQ of 200, it can't understand anything that's out here. You just can't see that. That's where the food comes from, right? That's the plows and the sunshine and the rain and the seeds and the airplanes and the trucks that move the food to the grocery store and refrigerators and light bulbs in the refrigerator and all the stuff that leads up to that food going down into that small intestine and into that stomach. It's all important. It's all important to that intestinal bacterium. It feeds it, but that intestinal bacterium just can't know anything about it, no matter how smart it is. It's just outside of its ability to perceive. Well, that's the way the larger consciousness system is to us, and you have to realize that you just can't know everything. Because we are what we are, there are limits to what we can perceive and what we can know. Now, if we're stuck in here, in our universe, this is our physical universe, we can get out into that non-physical because we're consciousness, and it's consciousness. And then we can get out into this larger consciousness system because we're consciousness. So we're not stuck in the physical reality, but getting out past that consciousness, getting out into this area, well, we just can't go there. But that doesn't mean that it isn't important. It doesn't mean that it doesn't affect us. It doesn't mean that it isn't critical to our survival and to what we do. It just means that it's outside of our ability to know anything about it. So the bad news is that you not only don't know everything, but you can't know everything. The good news is that being unable to know everything does not imply that you cannot know anything. One can still figure out a whole lot without knowing everything. I have an observation that I have made looking at these ideas, and that is that the smaller your reality, the more convinced you're likely to be that you know everything. And that's true whether you're a 2-year-old, a teenager, a philosopher, a theologian, or a physicist. The smaller your reality, the more likely you are to think you know everything. Okay. So here's the two assumptions. Assumption one is that a potential energy exists, it's capable of self-modification, and it can see at least this way and that way. Two independent states of itself. The second one is that systems with many complex potential outcomes, evolution directs and encourages change toward more profitable states of being. And with consciousness, as we've said, the more profitable state of being is lower entropy, because in an information system, that means more content, more information. Okay, and assumption one sounds like it's weak, right? It sounds like something that's unsubstantiated, but that's not the case. It's absolutely required. If you're going to have a big toe, if you're going to have a big picture theory of everything, you have to have at least one of your assumptions outside of physical reality. You can't have a big toe that takes into consideration consciousness if all of your assumptions are centered in physical reality. You have to have at least one assumption outside, or you can't get outside. So that's our one, and evolution exists is just basically a process. Any self-changing system that's complex will change itself to more profitable states. So those are the only two assumptions that we really have. That leads us to a summary, and then we'll stop and go to lunch after the summary. So what we've done so far is to tell you that consciousness is best modeled by a superset, a self-modifying digital information system capable of computing virtual realities. Okay, the superset is talking about this physical reality being the subset. It's the superset. We're just a piece of it. The larger consciousness system evolves by lowering the entropy of the system. That's how it evolves. It lowers the entropy of the system by organizing the bits at its disposal to a more profitable configuration. Okay, content creation and reorganization opportunities are generated by using conscious intent to apply free will choice to incoming experience data, and feedback of the results of previous choices allow us to modify future choices. You see, so these last three bullets are all kind of in a cycle of lowering entropy and evolution. So that's kind of where we are. That's the summary. And then from this, we're going to derive us. What are we? How do we fit into this? How are we as subsets of consciousness? And why is it that we're logically necessary for the system to create us? And then our physical reality. What makes it logical necessary for our physical reality, this virtual reality, to be created by this consciousness system? So those are the next two, but we're going to have to wait till after lunch to get to that. And then we'll get into more interesting things like virtual reality and stuff that will twist your mind. So that's it for now. Let's go have lunch. So let's get back in an hour. So we have answered where does the consciousness system come from, at least about as well as we can answer it. And next is where do individuals like you and I come from? Okay, generating experience and individual existence. Because experience is the generator of input, consciousness facilitates its own evolution by creating many smaller units of consciousness and setting them loose to evolve by interacting with free will. Okay, that's the general statement. Okay, what that means is that you have this one monolithic consciousness that we talked about before. Now this consciousness has to evolve. How is it going to evolve? It has to evolve through interaction, through experience. You can only learn and create more information, lower your entropy, through experience and interaction. And all it could interact with was itself. That's very limiting. It can lower its entropy by creating a more complex pattern of interaction than just interacting with itself. So just as the cells divided early on in the primordial ooze and made multi-celled creatures and then made creatures who had specialization in their cells, this does a similar thing. It breaks itself apart, cells divide, if you will, and now you have several chunks of consciousness interacting with each other. Suddenly the opportunity for novelty, for something different to happen, goes up. So then the cells divide again, and now you have lots of little chunks of consciousness interacting with each other with free will. So you see, every time that happens, the potential for newness, for novelty, for having new situations that you have to deal with, that you have to learn from. All of these things start to grow. So the consciousness system becomes more complex. It becomes more highly organized, and it reduces its entropy. So this is on the evolutionary path of consciousness system, is to break itself apart into pieces, let the pieces interact with free will, and through that interaction then it can evolve. So that tells us something then very fundamental about our reality. The purpose and positive direction of our evolution is defined as lowering entropy. We've already said that lowering entropy is equivalent to love, becoming love. Okay, so now here we are, and what's our goal? Our goal is to evolve the quality of our consciousness. And that defines positive and negative, good and bad. What's positive? It's what lowers our entropy. What's bad is what raises our entropy. So now we have definitions of all of these things. Morality, it's the same way. Spiritual growth, love, all defined as measurable quantities in terms of entropy. So we exist as a part of the larger consciousness system. What is our job? Our job is to interact, experience. What do we do with that experience? We make choices from our decision space. And the way we make those choices determines whether we are growing, evolving, or de-evolving. Okay, so now a consciousness system can only do those two things. It can either evolve or it can de-evolve. It's hard to stay the same, and it's the same with us. We can evolve, we can lower our entropy, or we can de-evolve, we can raise our entropy. Those are our only two choices. Staying the same is really not an option. It's a temporary option. We can stay the same for a while, but eventually you wander off one side or the other of this divide. So that's our goal. It's our purpose in this existence. We are part of the larger consciousness system strategy for evolving. Okay, so as we evolve individually, the whole system evolves because we are parts of that system. The system is us, and we are it. Okay, so as we evolve, it evolves. All right, so that's why we are. That's what we as individuals are doing and what our purpose is and how we fit into this larger consciousness system. We're a strategy for its evolution. Now, what about physical reality? So here you have all these individuated units of consciousness. They're interacting with each other, but they need rules. They need structure in order to produce a context for that interaction. Without the rules and structure, their interaction has no context. It would be like you were in a chat room, say on the internet, and there were no rules. There was no particular etiquette. There was no subjects that couldn't be talked about. Everything was entirely open, and there was no consequences, no matter what you did or what you said. Okay, just a bunch of individuals interacting without any traction. So any little 6-year-old could claim that they were 60 years old, and anyone who wanted to talk about science could claim they were a scientist, and anybody who wanted to say anything could really say anything, and you'd have no idea whether they were making it up, whether they weren't, who it was, and from time to time in a chat room you would never know, because they can all come in and anybody could say their name was George or Harry or anything else. So where's the traction? How do you learn from that interaction if you don't know, if there's no steadiness to it, if there's no rules? So that's why we have to have this physical matter reality. This is a place that gives us context. It gives us rules. It makes our interaction understandable and gives us feedback so that we can learn. Okay, the rules produce purpose, direction, defines profitability. It can The constraints provide structure, allows for choices, organization. They define limits of interaction. The rule set tells us what we can do and what we can't do and the consequences of doing or not doing. So process, strategy, logic, order, feedback, results, the rules, constraints, all of those are required for us to actually be in this game and have a good chance of making good choices to grow up and become love. So that's why we need this physical reality. It makes our communication mean something. There's structure to it. There's history to it. Okay, without constraints, you have only chaos. Evolution is very difficult. The rule set defines our virtual physical reality. Physics provides the constraints. By physics, I mean all the rules in the rule set. That's our science. Okay. So the logical structure here that we've done in the last several slides is that evolution requires free will choice and change through experience. Then experience requires interaction, an expression of consciousness quality. Meaningful interaction requires structure, purpose, and feedback. Okay, so the result of those logical steps means that learning, entropy reduction, requires structured interaction and feedback. So we have this reality set. This virtual reality then gets developed for us to interact in so that we can learn. And there's feedback into this system. There's several kinds of feedback. You have one obvious feedback is that the kind of person you are, the kind of choices you make, affects other people, and those other people will reflect your choices. In other words, if you're a very self-serving, unpleasant person that just uses other people, then you will have other people not like you very much because that's not the kind of person they want to be friends with, that they want to interact with. Whereas if you're full of love, you're full of good humor, you like people, then people will like to be around you. So that's some feedback you get based on the choices you make. Okay, you also get feedback in that you can modify probable future using your intent. You also have feedback from the point that you make your own reality. You have feedback from your interpretations. You get data. You interpret that data. As those interpretations help you or hurt you, lead you toward your goal of lower entropy or not, that's feedback. You get to modify your interpretations of the reality. So there's lots of feedback in this system for growing. Let's see. So it's us. It evolves as we evolve. And I have this one little analogy that I like for the technical people. They'll like it. For the people who are not technical, they'll probably dislike it. But I say it anyway because I'm technical and I like it. So that is the way a air conditioner works, or a heater, a heat pump. I don't know if you have heat pumps here, but it's a device like an air conditioner. It's a compressor. And the way the physics of a compressor works is if you compress a gas, it gets hot. The tighter you squeeze it together, the hotter it gets. And when you expand a gas that's under pressure out through a little hole, it cools. Okay, so all your heat pump is, your air conditioner and your heater and the heat pump, is just pumping a gas through a little hole. Builds up pressure on this side of the hole, expands on the other side of the hole. Pump builds up pressure and just keeps going round and round and round. That's called the working fluid, okay, in the system. And what it does is you have a heat exchanger hooked to the high pressure side, and that gets hot. That's heat. You put heat in your house when you want it, and then it expands as it goes through the little hole. It expands, and that's cool, and that's your air conditioner. So that's how it works, and the fluid just keeps going round and round and round and round. Used to be Freon, now it's other things, but we are similar to that as far as the larger consciousness system and our evolution. We just keep going around and around and around this because we are the working fluid, if you will, in a consciousness evolution and an entropy reduction engine. And we do this in multiple, what I call experience packets, which you might interpret as lifetimes. So you come here and you lower your entropy, and then you go around a cycle, and you come here again and you lower your entropy. Why cycles? Because it's too much to learn in one shot. There's an awful lot to learn to growing up, and it's a continuous process. It's never over. It's not done. You keep recycling, you keep growing. As you grow a little bit, the system grows a little bit. So you can think of us in this physical reality as just part of a consciousness reduction engine, if you will, evolving. And we help each other do that by our interactions. Okay. So how does the physical reality produced? So now we know the reason, the logic behind why we need a physical reality, because otherwise we'd have a hard time getting a handle on what we were doing and on our interactions. It'd be hard to grow from them. Okay, but how's it actually produced? Well, in World of Warcraft or in The Sims, those realities are produced by programmers, right? They're programmed. Every tree there has to be planted there by a programmer, given a location, given what it looks like. That's not the case with our reality. Our reality evolves. It has its own big bang. I call it the big digital bang. So you start this simulation, and we have here simulations like this. You start a simulation with a lot of energy, high temperatures and high pressures in a little spot, and you let it expand. And as it expands, it cools. But this is just a simulation, you see. It's just a simulation in a computer. And as it expands and cools, matter coalesces, you get suns, you get this universe, and that is where our physical reality comes from. It evolves. And eventually one of those suns had planets around it with about the right temperature and things that had some chemicals that got together, some proteins, and formed some cells, and then those cells divided. You see, it's all part of a repetition in the process. Okay, it's a fractal process. So we repeat the same sort of things that happens within consciousness. So those cells divided, and then they ended up evolving into us. Now, what's the rule set? The rule set was the rules that under which this reality formed, under this big digital bang. Now, what created this big digital bang? Well, somebody pushed the run button in the computer. That's what happened. Okay, so it's just a digital simulation. So that's what this reality is. It's a virtual reality, a simulation, and the rules that created the simulation determine what happened here, and we're the result of what happened here. Okay, something like us came out of this simulation, yet we're just consciousness, right? But we're constrained by the rule set in this virtual reality, just as the players in World of Warcraft are constrained to live by the rule set that determines their game. You know, so here's our game. We have a rule set. We have to live by it because that's what we are. But the rule set and the back and the graphics, if you will, are not programmed. They're evolved, and there's a big difference there. And we'll get back to that and say that a few more times in different ways, make it a little easier to get. Okay. Now, our virtual reality is not the only virtual reality. There are a lot of virtual realities. When you dream, that's a different virtual reality frame. Or if you go out of body, that's a different virtual reality frame. When you die, your consciousness becomes aware and awake in a different virtual reality frame. These are all virtual realities. The only fundamental reality is consciousness itself. The consciousness system, that's fundamental reality. Everything that's experiential is a virtual reality. Virtual realities were created for us to experience in, which means interact. Interact with each other, interact with the stuff. It's an interactive reality. Okay, so virtual itself, the word virtual means informational, computed. Okay, virtual reality is relative to the actual reality where the computation's being done. So the consciousness system is the actual reality. Consciousness is the only thing that's fundamental. All other realities are virtual. All experiential realities are virtual, realities in which you, as a separate being, experience and interact with a multitude of separate things and beings, where interactions appear to be more than abstract data. These are virtual realities. Dreams, out of body. If you read Bob Monroe's books, he defines his realities in terms of locale 1, locale 2, and locale 3. These are just different kinds of data that he was getting, different kinds of virtual realities. Virtual realities are created to generate personal experience. Evolution of the individual requires personal experience. Effective evolution of the system requires evolution of the individual. It's our role. Okay, thus the system evolves virtual realities for use of its subsets, us. Now, individuals may produce virtual realities, realities based on information within their imagination or within their computers. See, it's a fractal system. You have the larger consciousness system. It evolves, computes a virtual reality. In the same way, inside our virtual reality, we create World of Warcraft and other virtual realities. You see how it's a fractal system. It's all done in different sizes and scales, but it's the same basic principles being repeated. And those principles are basically it's consciousness itself as the media, and evolution as the process. Okay. So we're characters in a virtual reality, making characters in a virtual reality. One day, when our computers become sufficiently conscious, they may generate virtual realities within themselves. Reality is a fractal process, a consciousness evolution process, fractal. Okay. So, how is this virtual reality playing in the scientific world? Well, it's been playing actually quite a long time. It was first talked about seriously in a academic forum by Edward Fredkin. He started the digital physics movement in 1992, and now that's a worldwide movement. There's literally hundreds and hundreds of physicists who call themselves digital physics, and they basically their look at reality is that reality is a simulation, essentially digital, informational. We live in a simulation, so they're already there as far as seeing that this is better physics. And Fredkin, he was a pretty hotshot physicist himself, MIT, Boston University, now Carnegie Mellon. So he's still a working physicist. He's still very well respected in the community. And he says that we live in a virtual simulation. Okay, Nick Bostrom, he's head of a department at Oxford, wrote a paper called You're Living in a Computer Simulation. And the result of his research led him to believe that it's almost certain that we live in a virtual reality. That's where the philosophy, he has degrees both in philosophy and physics. And he takes the virtual reality very seriously. Then lastly, I have Brian Whitworth. Now I have all three of these a decade apart. There's literally dozens of these people that I could list that have taken on the virtual reality concept. But Edward Fredkin started in 1992, and then it was probably 2001 or 2 where Nick Bostrom came up, and now Brian Whitworth is current. Brian started his work called The Physical World as a Virtual Reality, and he compared what do we know in physics, what are the data points, what's the facts that we know, and then here's how we can support those facts with a virtual reality, here's how we can support them with the objective reality. And he didn't have a dog in either fight. He just wanted to see which one was better because they were two competing ideas. And he came to the conclusion that he expressed in his last paragraph of that article was, physicists, wake up. A virtual reality describes the facts better and more accurately than the objective reality assumption. So we have some fundamental science now going on that is stepping off in this direction. However, neither Fredkin nor Bostrom nor Whitworth nor dozens of others at universities who see the truth of the fact that we're living in a virtual information-based reality would dare expand their scope to present a big picture that includes metaphysics or the paranormal. That's still a taboo subject. But at least we're getting started. We're going down that path.